So far during this year, we have seen the creation of various societies and particularly civilizations. During this unit, we're going to begin to see them become more interrelated. We're going to see them begin to become connected. Although at the end of those units we had seen the creation of several important civilizations, they were really largely isolated from each other. They were kind of self-contained. At the very end of that, we began to see the creation of some networks that began to connect them together. This is more than just a trade route that connects point A to point B, although assuredly that is an important part of this. This is also the creation of larger routes, things like the Silk Road and the Indian Ocean that became key connectors of various civilizations. One of the other major networks that had been established during the classical era, the Mediterranean, was largely collapsing. These trade routes, these networks, are important economically most assuredly, but they are also important because of the establishment of what we call cultural diffusion, the connection of various societies. This is a major concept of the College Board and one we need to pay attention to during this next unit. In many cases, cultural diffusion is kind of a byproduct of other processes. It's not the end in and of itself, but it can also be more intentional. It's what we call syncretism. Syncretism is a blending of the concepts and cultures and so on to create a kind of a compromise and a new culture, one that brings in various features. This can come from the spread of many different things. It can encompass the spread of ideas and concepts, whether they be religious or knowledge or whatever. It can be the connection of various goods and services between societies. It can include the exchange of technology and the understanding of things that could be helpful from one society to the other. And it can include the spread of various customs. But the key to this, whether it be syncretism or just cultural diffusion, is that when this is done, in many cases what the societies end up doing is adapting the good and helpful things that they see in a different culture, but they also change them and make them their own. At the same time as this, not only are they adopting the new from somebody else, they are still trying to keep their own identity as well. Just as when we've talked about comparisons, we talk about similarities and differences, so too during this unit we can begin to think about this in terms of how things change over time. Things change over time, but they also maintain themselves and provide continuity, keeping that identity going. Whether it be syncretism or just plain diffusion, one might ask where this comes from, how this happens. Well, we've already seen that to a degree. It's just going to get a lot bigger and more important during this particular unit. One possible source of diffusion is settlement. Think, for example, of the Aryans coming into India and bringing their ideas that became the Hindu religion. Or it might come through conquest. Think, for example, of Alexander the Great and Hellenism and how that spread throughout the world, or what Rome did to many places throughout the world when they conquered them. It might also just come from trade. The Phoenicians are a good example of this, or even the Han Chinese Empire when it built the Silk Road and began to make connections with the Romans. It could also come, however, from education and observation, a more conscious choice. And in this unit, we're going to see one particular example of that, what Japan did when it began to send observers to China and adopt customs from them. Regardless, one of the things we're going to see in this unit is a change in what I call the axis of influence, the center of the world. It's going to go from isolated nodes, various civilizations that are relatively separate from each other, as we saw at the end of the first two units, to one that focuses on a connection between China and the Middle East, one that is based on the Silk Road and to a large degree as well, the Indian Ocean trade. This becomes the real center of the universe, or the world as we know it, at least, during this time period. That may be happening in much of Asia, but the reality is, particularly in Western Europe, they really fell out of that network. They entered into a period that we call the Dark Ages. It sounds so romantic, but it's not. People were ignorant, Life was a struggle to just barely survive at subsistence level. It's the age of manorialism, of feudalism, of economic and social structures that create a life in Western Europe. And the other basis, or pillar as I like to call it, of Dark Ages Europe is the Catholic Church. Catholicism becomes the glue that holds much of society together. If Western Europe is dropping out of the world networks, there are others joining in. Notably, in the case of this unit, we'll look at Japan. They become another hub in this era, and in many ways are a feudal country, much like Western Europe. So we'll see again similarities, differences, things to be thinking about as we go. There are also a few residuals left over from the end of the classical era, who we will see continue and develop during this time period, particularly in many cases in the West. For example, the Byzantine Empire that arose out of the fall of Rome and became a new dominant force in much of Europe and the Middle Eastern region. We'll also look a little bit at the Vikings, a really interesting group who probably merit more time than we're going to be able to give them, but have vast influence to the west, to the east, throughout Europe, all over the place. In another group that we will at least briefly talk about are what I'll call the Russians. It's really the Slavic people that settled in the area that we now think of as Russia, led to a degree, at least at the end of the Dark Age era, by that man on the right, Vladimir of Kiev, a rather interesting fellow, to put it mildly.